Thank you for joining us on this Uncharted Waters webinar, The Impact of COVID-19 on Newcomers, Lessons from the Ground. My name is Sudhir Nair. I am a faculty member at the Gustavson School of Business at the University of Victoria. I'm joined by my co-panelist, Jean McRae, who's the CEO of ICA. I just want to take a minute and talk about the session today. We'll start with the territory acknowledgement, go over some introduction of both of Jean. I'll have some comments followed by Jean's comments, and then me and Jean will have a quick conversation. And then we want to hear from you on what your thoughts are, comments, questions, and if we can answer any of those questions, we would love to do so and get a conversation going. So that's where we are. As I said before, I just want to say that I'm speaking from the University of Victoria, and I want to start by the territory acknowledgement. I acknowledge with respect to Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Sangis, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. I think the topic today lends itself deeply in a very deep sense with that territory acknowledgement, right? We're talking about newcomers, and newcomers to which place? It's to a given place. We're less than a week away from Canada Day. I think it's a critical time to think about how different groups of people, how we fit in what Canada is, what Canada has been, and what Canada can be. And an essential part of that conversation has to be the discussion about newcomers. And so to talk about newcomers, I think we couldn't have found a better person than Jean McRae. Jean is the CEO of the Intercultural Association of Greater Victoria. She holds a BA, a CP Ed, and an MBA. She is sector co-chair for Pathways to Prosperity. I'm hoping she'll speak more to some of her other roles. She's also the past president of the affiliation of multicultural societies and service agencies of BC, referred to as AMSA. She represents AMSA on the National Settlement Council and the Canadian Immigration Settlement Sector Alliance. She has a lot of hats. Jean has also been working in the immigrant and refugee space since 1982. So this is her fourth decade of doing this. And she has also spent 3 years working with refugees in Central America. So welcome, Jean. Thank you for doing this. I thought, just to start with, I would speak a little bit about, just setting up a platform on what we've seen in this newcomer space. I teach international business and strategy at the Gustavson School of Business, but I am also involved in what the Victoria Forum is, which is an event, which was supposed to be in the fall, but now with COVID, it's become more of a virtual conference. And I'm a track chair in the economic divides track. And so in some ways, all these conversations, to me, they're important, and they build on each other, and they're sort of self-reinforced. So hopefully some of these comments will echo with a lot of the folks here, and let's see where we go with it. So sometimes I hear this confusion. A lot of people go like, wait, what's a newcomer? What's a migrant? What's an immigrant? What's a refugee? This talk is going to be fairly practice and sort of, a general conversation. But I do want to spend some time on the definition. I think there's two broad schools of thought. One is an inclusivist definition of migrants, which is refugees are one kind of migrants, right? You could have people who move for economic reasons, for family reasons, for education, for work, temporary work, permanent work. There's a whole host of reasons people migrate, and refugees are just one part of it. The residualist definition tends to think of migrants as sort of economic migrants or family migrants as being separate in some sense from refugees. I have had the opportunity to work with ICA and other organizations like ICA, and I really like the term many of them use, which is newcomer. I think newcomers is a good way to sort of say, well, you're new in this space. How you got here is important, but is not definitional, right? But these definitions do matter. We have two different organizations at the United Nations that deal with, One is the IOM, which deals with migrants, and UNHCR deals with refugees. So definitions do matter, and we might use them interchangeably, but I personally prefer the term newcomer. I think that's a really good way to think of the space. I want to talk a little bit about some of the myths, right? Sadly, these are not myths that just happen because of COVID and the situation we find ourselves in. I think these are myths that exist, have existed, and continue to exist from before. And so one of the myths is that newcomers to any society don't help the economy. So I pulled up some data from the US, and I'm going to use data from different countries just to make the point that some of these issues make sense across boundaries. 3 million immigrants have started small businesses, right? And they hire 6 million people, and they pay over $120 billion in wages to these employees. They have an economic value, they generate over $65 billion in revenues. So they do help the economy. And we can look at a lot of sort of anecdotal information, but this is sort of just a factual piece of information that sort of gets away from this idea that newcomers are only taking away resources rather than putting resources in. There's a whole host of research which talks about the vibrancy they bring in, the ways of working, the cultural aspects, and just the sheer ethical argument of what newcomers and what societies should do with it. So this is fairly instrumental, but I think it's important to note. Newcomers take away jobs. There's a fascinating video, if anyone gets a chance. Esther Duflo, who won the Nobel Prize in economics earlier this year, talks about it. Some data from Miami, where a lot of Cuban refugees came in after the revolution. They found in Cuba, they found that the refugees actually added to the economy, and wages went up as a result of their arrival, not down, right? Right now, Germany, Italy, and the UK each need between 300,000 and 400,000 seasonal workers because of farm labor. And in fact, the UK has enlisted Prince Charles to come help, convince and plead with UK residents to join the Pick for Britain campaign, sort of saying that this is your opportunity to do what volunteers did during World War II. It's at that level. So we sort of say that, well, if these folks weren't here, we would have domestic folks pick up the slack, so to speak. But that's not happening. In Canada, for example, we're still dealing with the fact that there's a lot of migrant labor needed, temporary foreign workers, for farms, both in BC, in Alberta, and maybe they don't get all the help they need, by the way. So COVID is impacting them really hard. For example, the Cargill plant in Alberta had some of the worst cases of COVID in Canada, and it's something to think about, that we need them. We first accuse them of taking away jobs, but we do need them, and then we say we're not going to take care of you. So it's something to think about, right? There's this argument that newcomers are not qualified. Statistics Canada has looked at this data, and they find that at least half of immigrants have at least a bachelor's degree in the 25 to 64 age group, which compares to about a quarter of the Canadian born population, right? And also economic immigrants, and I will admit that we're talking about a group which probably is already economically well settled. The economic immigrants exceed Canadian resident earnings, right, and are 20% more likely to be working. Another argument is newcomers cause social upheaval. They looked at some of the data, and the lowest level of immigration in the US was in the 1960s, and they found the maximum societal upheaval. Now, I don't think there's enough data to talk about what's going on in the US right now. We probably need some space before we can talk about what's going on now. But it's kind of interesting. Social upheaval was at its maximum in the 60s when immigration was at its lowest. An interesting piece of information comes from IRCC in the Canadian context, which is that 93% of immigrants have a strong sense that they belong to Canada and they're proud of it, right? I think that's an important way to look at it, is that these folks are thinking of themselves as being part of the society they've chosen to live in. So I just want to hear, get a sense of where everyone is. There's a poll question that should have appeared on your screen. And the question is, how many people do you think have been forced into being refugees from the Syrian crisis, right? Is it less than 1 million, 1 million to 3 million, 3 million to 5 million, or is it more than 5 million? I'll just give you a few seconds. All right, I think, Cecilia, I think we can just stop it there. So it's interesting. About 15% said between 1 and 3 million. No one thought less than a million. 45% thought between 3 million and 5 million. And more than 5 million, there was 40%. So between 3 and 5, or 3 and above, is almost 85%. And the actual number is over 6 million, right? So there's over 6 million folks have been forced into being refugees as a part of the Syrian crisis. So it's a massive crisis, right? And actually 1 out of 6 of current refugees are from Syria. So it's important to understand that, okay? So I'm just going to, and I'm glad that folks understand the severity of the situation. I'm drawing a lot of the data from the Global Trends report that just came out a little while ago. About 80 million people have been forced to move. 46 million are internally displaced. That means they're displaced, but are in their own countries. And 34 million are international. And so when you see the 6 million figure, that gives you a sense of where the Syrian crisis is. There's 4.2 million people, refugees, currently awaiting outcome of asylum requests, right? So that's a massive number of folks just in limbo, waiting to hear. What is also interesting is in the 90s, over 1 million people were able to return home. That has now dropped dramatically to 385,000 per year. So the need to help refugees is substantially increased. And that's something the world has to think about, right? 30 to 34 million of those who are displaced, depending on whose numbers you look at, are children. So that's, again, a massive number of folks who are having to deal with very young individuals. Most displaced families are forced to leave their old family members behind because it's fairly traumatic and they don't know how to deal with it. So think of the emotional trauma being imposed on families that are choosing to leave. Many of them are leaving respected older family members behind. 80% are in countries dealing with acute food insecurity. So how do we deal with that? And 77% are in situations of long-term displacement. We've seen camps, for example, in Kenya, in sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of the Middle East, where there's just long-term displacement, and we have to understand what we have to, to do about situations like that. So just another quick question. It's just this: which of these countries do you think, and I would love to hear from all of you, host the most refugees, right? Is it the US? Is it Canada? Is it Germany? Is it Turkey? I don't think we seem to have Jordan, but let's say these 4, right? USA, Canada, Germany, or Turkey. So yeah, let's look at the results. And it's interesting, most people think it is Germany, and the second option is Turkey, third is Canada, and it's the US. Actually, Turkey, by a large margin, is the country where the most refugees are. Germany does come a distant, I think, 8th. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Jordan, these are all countries that host a lot more refugees. So much of our narrative in the media is on what Canada is doing, the US is doing, and Germany, but we tend to forget that massive amounts of refugees actually live in Turkey, in Jordan, in Pakistan. Bangladesh because of the Rohingya situation, right? So these are countries who are struggling to handle the issue. And so it's important to keep that in mind when we look at these issues. So more specifically in the Canadian context, does Canada need newcomers? The point is Canada's fertility rate is pretty low. And by 2040, a large part of Canada will be old, and immigration is desperately needed because 100% of labor growth over the next 5 years is just simply immigration. And if we don't do that, we're going to have problems just sustaining our economy. In 2020, we were supposed to bring in 370,000, but because of COVID, I think the drop is going to yield only 200,000 PRs this year. And which is sort of a massive, almost half decline in what we expected. And this is massive decreases in all categories: PR, migrant workers, international students. Students, this is a particular interest to me as I'm an academic. It's a key demographic for immigration. In many universities, they contribute massive amounts to the budgets. The University of Toronto, for example, is looking at a budget shortfall of $200 million on a $3 billion budget. So it's, how do we deal with this? And we don't know what the long-term impact is on immigration because many of the students stay on and become immigrants, right? We have to figure that out. So I just have one last poll question. You can just share your responses in the chat. What do you think this picture is showing? It's just some women holding up a poster with the Canadian flag on it and saying, "Welcome to Canada." And if you go to the chat, you should be able to type in messages. Cecilia, I hope it's open for everyone to type in their responses.
Yes, it's on now.
Okay, great, thank you. So I'd love to hear what you think. Very nice, a vision of hope. That's beautiful. Family members welcoming refugees from Syria. Yeah, welcoming. Yeah, showing absolutely. Fantastic. Residents welcoming newcomers. I think all of, at the airport welcoming newcomers to Canada. Yes, it is about welcoming, and this is definitely about all those things, and it's just fantastic. But I just want to sort of say the specific one is of a young girl with her family, and this was the first Syrian refugees at Toronto's Pearson Airport who were welcomed into Canada in December 2015. I've always thought of this a fairly poignant reminder of that. We've been dealing and hopefully been welcoming of folks from Syria and other countries for a long time. Okay, thank you all. So our policies being improved. We've heard about the H-1B workers in the US. Not so much. And actually, we also hear that students have been asked to leave if they're taking classes online. That was just announced in the US yesterday. We think of New Zealand as being fairly progressive, but the Deputy Foreign Minister is a New Zealand First party leader, and it's a coalition government and is seeking to drastically cut immigration into New Zealand. Canada was first to temporarily halt all refugee sponsorship. So the COVID-19, there's lots of issues, and I'm sure Jean is going to speak a little bit about some of these barriers. Before I give it on to Jean, I'm just going to leave this for a few seconds. Please understand that most countries on the planet have signed on to the UN 1951 Convention. Refugees have rights. It's not that we're just sort of, they're breaking the law and so we get to do anything. No, they have rights, and I'm not going to go over that. But I'm just going to now move on to having Jean speak. Sorry, Jean, I probably went a little over. Thanks.
That's okay. Thanks, Sudhir. That was a wonderful sort of look over of what's been going on and the refugee situation in particular. Say hi to all the people I know in the chat room. I see quite a few familiar names, so welcome. If we could just go to the next slide. What I'm just going to do, I know that some of you already know ICA, but I just do a little bit of just a bit of an introduction of who we are. So sorry, next slide is where we really need to start. There we go. There's ICA. So ICA has been offering services to newcomers in our region for 49 years. Next year, we'll celebrate our 50th year of working in the capital region. And we really see our role very much as not replacing any other of the wonderful organizations that are out in our community helping people, but really connecting people to those organizations and providing the bridge from when people arrive and know very little about where they're coming to being fully participating members, whatever that means for them, of our community. So we really want to help immigrants reach their goals, and immigrants, like all groups, are come with a huge variety of goals and aspirations. Many people coming into our community come to reunite with family members. That's a big part of our immigration to our region. Other people come for economic goals, and Sudhir, you referenced that. And then, of course, we have refugees. And I'll just make a note that for this community, we've had very few refugees until 2015, really 2016, with the Syrian movement. And our organization has been providing services to immigrants for many, many years. But we made a move to become a private sponsorship agreement holder. So we work with community groups. Sudhir is a member of one of our community groups who raise the money and provide the support for people who are coming in as refugees, sponsored by community groups, a unique program in Canada, and a Canadian program unique in the world. So we're very proud of being a part of that. And you saw the picture of the first Syrians being refugees being greeted in Toronto. Our first Syrian privately sponsored refugee arrived on January 31st in 2015, rather late at night. So it was not quite as expected, but it all turned out okay. But since then, we've welcomed a good number of Syrian privately sponsored refugees and privately sponsored refugees from other countries and parts of the world. And we have also, we were chosen to be one of the new refugee assistance program sites in 2016, early in 2016. So that means for the first time, it wasn't our first experience with this. 25 years before that, we did have government assisted refugees coming into Victoria, but we had a huge gap. And so then so now we work with government assisted refugees as well, as along with all the other immigrants coming from around the world. Just for information purposes, in Greater Victoria, the majority of people who we see as clients accessing services are people who are coming from Chinese backgrounds. I'm going to say ethnic Chinese. They don't all come from mainland China, that they come from that cultural group, broad-ranging cultural group. And then other than that, they come from everywhere. So it's really quite a multicultural group that arrives here. Maybe you could go to the next slide, Sudhir. So I said we've been here, started out in 1971. We were started by ethnic groups in this community who felt they needed to fight racism. And the way they would do that was to start a festival where people could meet each other, eat each other's food, enjoy each other's music and costume. And that was the beginning of multiculturalism in Canada around that time. And then we realized that wasn't the best way maybe to fight racism. It's a nice thing, good for the community, but we wanted to also address other issues. So we moved into services for refugees. Initially, it was only refugees, and then moved into other immigration classes. So for those of you that are not local, we serve the area in the map there, which is the capital region of BC. So we have 13 municipalities, we have 20 First Nations, we have an overall population of roughly 400,000 people. At ICA, we're welcoming on the refugee side, roughly 200 people a year now. We had a few more initially with the bump of Syrians coming in, but that's about the number we see. And there's just on the refugee side, there's about 200 or 250 people coming in every year. Really not a very big number. Sudhir pointed to Turkey. Well, I'll give you a stat for Lebanon, which is an adjacent, shares a border with Syria. In Lebanon, 1 in every 4 people is a refugee. So when you consider the size of the refugee population coming to our community, it's considerably less. It's sort of like inviting one more guest to your big wedding. So it's not really going to upset anybody too much. So we provide settlement services, which provide people with the information that they need in order to access services, make sure that they post social insurance numbers, make sure that they understand things like income tax and how it works in Canada, medical services, how the schools work. We work in all 3 school districts here with settlement workers in schools, helping newcomer children and their families as they access the public school system. We run settlement language classes. So this is a program that runs nationally called LINK, Language Instruction for Newcomers to Canada. I'd say it's about 50-50 language instruction and orientation information for people. How to call 911. What do you do if you feel you've got a household emergency, those sorts of things, and really linking people to all the information they need, including employment. So we run employment programs, varying employment programs. We have mentoring programs, which are very helpful in getting people connected to the job market. And yeah, I think maybe we'll stop there. I was going to say the one other thing to note just out of Sudhir's numbers, Canada has among the highest rates of immigrants, so permanent residents, turning into citizens. So taking up citizenship. So we also help people in preparation for citizenship classes. Maybe next slide, please. There we go. So, in a normal year, we see about 2,700 people come through our doors on any given day. We have about 500 people access language classes. Most of our services are face-to-face services. People come in and they sit down with an employment counselor or with a settlement worker, or they come into a class, or they participate in a group section or a workshop. And of course, all that closed down in the middle of March, like many other organizations. We had to stop that. We immediately moved into doing a triaging of our clients to make sure, anyone we thought might be particularly vulnerable and isolated on various levels, that we need, we make sure to reach out to them. And so we did a lot of outreach to clients, and then, sort of move through the list to make sure people were okay, that they understood what they needed to do in terms of COVID, isolation, all of those things. And we haven't seen any new arrivals. Our last government-sponsored refugee arrived at the beginning of March, and very fortunately went into permanent housing immediately, so was able to get through that. We have not seen any refugee arrivals since March. We just got news today that the government-assisted program would be opening up to arrivals, and that there will be some privately sponsored refugees arriving, with immigration focusing on those who either their urgent protection needs, or they are people who had already been approved and were ready to travel, or basically on their way to the airport, wherever they were going from, and then the flights were all suspended, so they were sort of stuck. So they're working first on those cases, and then we'll start to see a bit more movement. In terms of our services, we've moved to mostly online. Our English classes moved mostly online, and we saw between 75 and 80% of our students carrying on in the online environment. Fascinating to learn that some of them say that would be a much better thing, easier no parking issues, no busing issues, no daycare issues. They can just do their classes. So I expect as we go forward, we're going to be doing a little adjustment to how we do services, some face-to-face, some at a distance. We did at the beginning of June open up just for a couple of weeks with some of our lowest level classes. Those were people who often have literacy issues, including technology literacy issues, so that we could make sure that we were connecting with them and also get them some help to make sure that they could use technology as well as possible to access connection. And we're gradually opening up with all the precautions in place. So that's where we are. So I just thought, so there's no refugee arrivals, or very few, predicted in the near future. The 2020 immigration levels, which Sudhir had also mentioned, are just, there's no way they're going to be met in this, this calendar year. And there's questions about what it will look like in the future. Now, the fact that those immigration levels won't be met this year will have an effect, probably, unless there's some mitigation offered by government in terms of funding for services, because services are based on backward-looking 3-year rolling average of how many immigrants come into the country and what proportion of those immigrants go to each province, and then the funding goes from there. So we're expecting to see some shifts there, and we're hoping that they're not too drastic, because we are seeing a lot of people who really need services now. We know that immigrants were, there's some good stats that show that immigrants were disproportionately affected across the country in terms of unemployment, losing their jobs. It's sort of, when you think about it, if you're the last person into the workplace, you're often the first person out of the workplace when there's layoffs necessary. So that certainly has affected immigrants disproportionately to long-term residents of Canada or just citizens here. The other thing we note is that many newcomers are working in what we are now understanding as essential positions. So working in grocery stores, working cleaning in medical facilities, working in care homes for the elderly. So those sorts of things, it's sort of an interesting shift. So they've been, in general, disproportionately affected by unemployment, but at the same time, many of them are in these essential positions. And of course, we're seeing that many newcomers, people who are not permanent residents, who are temporary residents, temporary foreign workers, are also in those essential roles, so picking vegetables and helping out in those temporary roles. So you will have seen some of that in the media, I'm sure. Maybe just go to the next slide. I see I'm going a little bit over time, so I'll try not to go on for too long and let us get into the discussion. So yeah, we're looking at, right now, the Canadian government is doing a consultation process to look at immigration levels going forward each year in the beginning of November. IRCC, the Immigrant, Refugee and Citizenship Canada, need to present to Parliament an immigration plan, which outlines which classes of immigration and how many in each class. So, that's something that's coming up, and there's a lot of considerations for the government as it sets that policy. We know from looking backwards that when we've had times of high unemployment, people's willingness to be, positive about bringing in immigrants tends to erode a bit. When there's low unemployment, as we've had in our area, very low unemployment, one of the lowest unemployment rates across Canada for several years now, we've had people are much more supportive of immigration because they see it as a way of filling labor market needs. So, those questions are certainly in the mix. There has been some suggestion from people who, in various sectors and advocates in various ways, saying this would be a prime opportunity for Canada to land some of those temporary residents, refugee claimants, people who are in Canada, who are working in essential roles, just, it wouldn't be an amnesty, but just provide some way to land people quickly so that we are able to keep our numbers up. in part because, as you see, Sudhir, you referred to the birth rate and those sorts of things, our aging population, whether, we're definitely in some kind of an economic crisis, a bit unprecedented, and people aren't quite sure how we'll come out of it, but we are still in a demographic crunch. And Victoria, in our area, we're kind of leading in that demographic crunch where we've got a lot of aging people and not so many people replacing them in the workplace. So there's lots of need around here. The employment prospects for newcomers, obviously a big goal for most people when they come is getting employment. And we try to get them employment, help them connect with employment as fast as they can. So that's an issue. Ensuring essential workers are available. I've already talked about that. Public attitudes, of course, is a key piece, and funding for services. So I think maybe I'll leave it there, and then we can move into discussions. Thanks so much. These are some of our beautiful young people working who have participated in one of our employment programs specifically for refugee youth. Such a nice picture, I had to include it.
That's a fantastic picture. This is a wonderful program that ICA runs, and I think it's just wonderful to see some of those folks. Thanks so much, Jean. We have some great questions in the Q&A, but before we get to those, I was hoping you might also just speak. I mean, you've touched on some of these other roles that you have. You're a co-chair at the Pathways to Prosperity program, and also AMSA. Would you mind that, which is more of a provincial initiative? So I know you've spoken from your vantage point as a CEO of ICA, which is based in the capital region. I'm just hoping you can also maybe give us a perspective on P2P and also AMSA.
Sure. Yeah, so maybe I'll start with AMSA and we'll go from the provincial to the national. But yeah, so AMSA is the umbrella organization for immigrant serving and multicultural organizations in the province. It's also been around for a good number of years. And through that, we work with our colleagues in order to identify policy issues, operational issues, anything that is really needs support. So AMSA has been doing a wonderful job, again, switching from face-to-face meetings to online meetings, lots of Zoom meetings in all of our lives these days. To look at making sure that people are aware of what we need to do in terms of COVID, and looking at the various issues that are coming up, talking to the national government and to our colleagues in other, through our networks in other provinces to see, what are the main issues coming up. There's been a lot of work that's gone in, collaborative work that's gone into figuring out, like, what are our plans, when we get to reopening, how are we doing that? What are our plans around meeting vulnerable client needs, assessing, all of those things. How do we look at bringing in those kinds of services? So there's been a lot of support there. At the national level, there's been a lot of work done through the National Settlement Council, which brings together all these various voices to look and work with our colleagues at IRCC, so with the Canadian government, on how best to implement things. How do we do things? We know that there's refugees in need, and there's slowing down the refugee intake. Canada is now one of the countries, with the United States pulling out of much of its responsibility around resettling refugees. Canada is really a safe haven country for many people who are having trouble getting here. So how do we keep fulfilling our obligation to those people in a way that's safe and doesn't endanger people in the community and doesn't endanger our workers and doesn't endanger refugees? So we're working hard on those sorts of questions at that level. With Pathways to Prosperity, this is a national research project that was funded up until this year by SSHRC and has now moved into IRCC funding. And some of the things that we look at a number of different things, work with many researchers across the country, but one of the key focus for the investigations is looking at the nature of communities, of welcoming communities, not just big communities, smaller communities. How does that play out? What things work well? We've been working hard on looking at developing evidence-based research on and looking at, best practices or promising practices in the settlement. We really are always working on. It's been a wonderful sector to work all these years in, because there really has been an endless sort of process of trying to improve what we do to make sure that we're better helping people and getting people timely information in a timely way to really help them advance. So that project is really helping at that level. And we're also working with a lot of researchers so that more researchers are familiar with the territory of immigrant settlement and the refugee settlement, so they can help us too.
Yeah, and I can attest to the wonderful data being collected, because it's some of the data I've used from the Pathways to Prosperity website. I encourage everyone to take a look at it, especially some of the folks here are researchers. I think it's of great value. If it's okay, Jean, I'll sort of pivot to some of the Q&A, some of the questions some of the folks have been asking, and there's some wonderful questions. I'll just go in the order that I'm seeing it. My colleague Stacy Fitzsimmons has a great question which sort of ties in with what you said earlier, the US pulling out on multiple fronts, right? And her question is, first she says, thank you for doing this, Jean. Do you think international students currently being kicked out of the US might come to Canada instead? And she's curious about how that American policy will influence us in Canada.
Well, I hope we'll take good advantage of the policy changes, to help people. I think we've seen already some movement, interest in Canada for students coming to Canada instead of the States, just because we look like a more stable and welcoming environment to people, and people make sensible choices around these things. So yeah, I anticipate that we will see more of that with some of the, we're already hearing some noises that with the high-skilled workers whose visas have been suspended in the States, that, I would think we very well may see some high-tech companies deciding to choose Canada. Some of them already have campuses in Canada, choosing to move some of their workers here, particularly their international workers. So that certainly could be advantageous to us, and certainly could be advantageous as we try to help the economy recover in this country. So yeah, I do think there will be some influences with that. I mean, we'll all be watching carefully what happens in the elections in November. Because I think if the US continues in its way, yeah, it could be, if Canada's smart about it, we might be able to take advantage.
Right. And I think just to add on to what Jean has been saying, I think immigration policy is now becoming definitional in economic terms too. I think there's a great awareness of policy, but there's no getting around the fact. I mean, yes, the H-1B situation, the student situation in the US, but there's fairly hard choices that UNHCR and other organizations are having to deal with US cutting back on funding. I put up that number, about 4.2 million people awaiting decisions on asylum. Someone has to fund that, and these are things that, like I said, in 1951, we had a convention, we have multiple conventions, we have, SDGs lined up, development goals, where everyone signs up for these things, but they have to be funded. And so it's important that we understand that, there's the benefit to Canada, of course, but
absolutely
the sheer humanity of it all.
I also might mention just there's been some preliminary research done by WES, which is Education Services, that Canadian organization that works with international students, and they did some initial surveying of the people they have. So they're people they're already working with, asking them, like, what would you, in this current COVID kind of situation, does this influence your interest in coming to Canada? And in fact, they had a very positive response, that people felt like maybe it made Canada a better place. I think how we've handled the current situation in the States is rather frightening to think about for anyone going into that. So I think people are also, how countries have handled COVID and go forward handling it, I think will make a difference in terms of people's interest. Great.
So Penelope has two questions, and I'm just going to just scroll up to see. So she's talked about having worked in a Newcomer service center in Alberta, and she raises a really interesting point, which is many of the Newcomer service centers aren't allowed to provide services for temporary foreign workers, right? And my understanding is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Jean, is that students can't really access some of the services that ICA offers.
Yeah.
So we're in this situation where, we need these temporary foreign workers, we need these students, but some of the entities like ICA that are set up to help them don't know how to do it. And so she goes on, she's talking about that. She's retired now, lives northwest of Duncan and hopes to help. And then she has a follow-up question, is Canada turning away refugees arriving via the US? So I'll let you pick it up in any order that you
Sure. Well, maybe I'll answer the second question first, because it's Canada has a safe third country agreement with the United States. And yes, we do turn people back to the United States. And just recently, some claimants who were trying to cross were turned back to the States, with COVID being the justification for that. So certainly there's a lot of advocacy going on right now to do two things. One is to end the safe third, or amend the safe third, so that people are not, that's an agreement whereby if people come via the United States to Canada to make a refugee claim, they can be turned back, because in theory, although I wouldn't agree in practice at this point, there's a fair refugee determination system in the United States. Well, we're not seeing that system working well, and hasn't been working well for some time. So, there's that is definitely there. No, Canada, the safe third has been a bit of a challenge in terms of refugees who come overland being able to come into Canada. So lots of advocacy in that area. And the second thing, yes, you're right. IRCC funding generally, so this is the federal funding, generally does not cover services for international students or for temporary residents. That said, there are some services that do help them. So the province of British Columbia has for years recognized that need. For a period of time, we had about 15 years when there was a devolution agreement between the federal government and the provincial government, and the provincial government was in charge of settlement services in British Columbia. They put in some of their money into that mix, and then they allowed us to, in fact, serve temporary residents. Mm-hmm. The money wasn't very much, so we tended to be mostly serving in crisis situations rather than sort of ongoing, sort of the kinds of services we're able to offer to permanent residents. It also allows for services to Canadian citizens. So sometimes people who come as immigrants, they have a crisis after they've become a Canadian citizen, and the place they come back to would be an organization like ours, and we weren't supposed to serve them. So, but I think we all are, we're a nonprofit, and there's some things that we can do off the corner of our desks that to help people. There are services for temporary workers in Victoria through the Immigrant Refugee Center. And we have been running a pilot program for the last year. It's just wrapping up now for temporary workers here to help them. That was funded through a different department of the federal government. So there's an awareness of the challenges there, but I think we're still we're always advocating for something, and that's one of the ones we continue to advocate for providing appropriate services, necessary services to people who aren't eligible for the regular federal funding.
Yeah, I think it's a these are really important issues, and I encourage everyone in the audience to also advocate. I think the more voices there are on these really critical issues, like what do we do with refugees who come overland after having landed in the US first? I think that's, like we put up in the conventions, they have rights, but then we have bilateral agreements which create complications. What do we do with students, right? How should students access services? But at some level, the federal government wants them to become permanent residents and citizens, but at the same point, there's stumbling blocks. Yeah. So carrying on with the question, Renee has a question on how do you think Americans who apply for immigration to Canada will be handled? I suspect this number may go up or down depending on the elections in November. Sorry, I'm being facetious here, but it's a really important question.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, the system is the system. They'll be handled the same way as you know, they have to make an application depending on the nature of their situation. You know, most, I don't think, especially with Safe Third, we get a situation where someone, an American, could apply for refugee status. I don't think they'd probably be able to make that cut, but people can certainly apply through family and through economic classes. And, you know, I have to remember too, that the Canadian system for family class, you know, there's parental sponsorship, there's, you know, to bring your parents in, but generally people are favored when they have a high education, they have a certain skill set that is necessary, you know, that we're short of people here for, or, yeah, and their age. So, you know, I wouldn't score well trying to come into Canada at this point because I'm past, you know, my working days are, you know, sort of shortening. So, you know, really people are looking for people generally in the economic classes who can either start a business, who come in with money. That's a small number in the mix, but otherwise it's economic classes, people who can join the workforce and contribute in that way. So.
Kingsland has an interesting question, and they ask, is there any program supported by ACA or other places for newcomers to know investment opportunities at Victoria, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, I'm a restaurant owner in Victoria and would like to sell the restaurant to potential entrepreneurs for immigration, right? So is there some sort of a program, and, you know, how does that work, I suppose?
Yeah, we don't directly work with that kind of investment. We do have a lot of immigrants who start small businesses, and we've worked with various entities, business entities, to try and encourage support for people, because especially with a restaurant business, it's a pretty risky business at the best of times. You know, the fail rate for restaurants is fairly high compared to some other kinds of industries. So, you know, we try to see if some of the economic development kind of groups can take on some of that stuff. I wouldn't say we're experts in economic development. We do certainly provide people with orientation to the banking system, to the finance system in Canada. It doesn't usually go to the level of including investment, mostly because it's a lack of expertise. Maybe we should be talking to the School of Business.
And we would be happy to, as we've mentioned, and I just want to say, the business school has been working with ICA on multiple fronts, and we continue to do so. You know, my colleague Sarah Eliash has been working with some of the folks at ICA on working on spaces for maker spaces for art and cultural, you know, entrepreneurs to come together, and I think that's a wonderful initiative. Ash Musavi has a great question, and, you know, I'm also aware of the time, and I'm just thinking in some sense it's you know, we have about 6 minutes left, and maybe we can get one more question after that, depending on how it goes. But Ash asks, and I think this is a critical issue, which is, you've mentioned that the number of newcomers using ICA and similar organizations services will affect, you know, will be affected by IRCC's funding, right? And I suspect a lot of different parts of provincial, city, provincial, and federal governments will be affected, you know, once we get past the immediate crisis of what we're doing with budgets. So does that mean that immigrant settlement services organizations will have to reduce their services in the future? And if so, you know, that might be a massive COVID effect on newcomers' life. And just maybe you can comment on that, Jean. I think that's a really good, fantastic question about how do we look, what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah. Hi, Ash. Nice to see your voice. Yeah, I think there is a risk of that if the immigration numbers go down, that organizations serving immigrants, their funding will also go down, because, as I mentioned, the funding is based on the number of people who come in. So really, to intervene in that, it would you know, there'd have to be some decisions made by government to not have it affect that, at least in the coming year. That said, you know, if we do have to reduce, yeah, that certainly is an impact. And I think there's across the nonprofit sector, there's various impacts. We might not see them right away, but we'll see them as time goes on and as decisions are made about who comes in and what classes, you know, whether Canada finds a way to live up to its obligations in the refugee space. That will affect, you know, certainly affect refugees in terms of connecting people to services here. You know, we're not serving everybody who comes through our door, are not people who came in the last year. We generally serve people for the first 3 to 5 years in Canada. So we've always had a challenge with the funding model. When the numbers go up and down, it doesn't necessarily change how many people are actually coming through our doors. And usually if we have a lift in numbers coming in, the funding doesn't catch up until, you know, a year later. So it's an interesting model. Again, lots of advocacy going on and has been for some time to try and get governments to consider a more flexible model that would be more responsive to what's actually going on in communities as opposed to what's happening in terms of destining numbers. But it's a challenging one because the model at this point needs to be agreed to by all the provinces and the federal government. So that's a challenging space for
everyone, yeah,
for decisions to be made. Yeah.
And if I may just add, Jean, I know this is definitely your area of expertise. I think, you know, I've looked at a lot of the information on immigration and what we should do. The one thing we have to remember is immigration is at a purely instrumental level, right? Mm-hmm. We forget just the ethical parts of what we should do with people who are dealing with literally life and death situations. But let's keep that aside. Purely from an instrumental perspective, all that information that I put up front, we need immigration.
Yeah,
right?
we do.
So the government has to understand that, you know, has to understand the immediate needs of budgetary situations and long term. This is the one thing that all the political parties agree on. It's just what those numbers are. You know, different political parties. I'm speaking about the Canadian context. I am not speaking of other countries. As I said, the US, New Zealand, the UK, there's populist governments sort of, you know, I'm not going to comment on that. But I think in the Canadian context, I think it's critical to remember that we have to sustain organizations that help newcomers settle. I mean, as some of the work, you know, all of you have been doing is just you know, it's incredibly important. What ICA does is incredibly important. The government can help on the structural side, but on many of the more soft settlement services, things like what Jean, you talked about in terms of, you know, how do children socialize at school? You know, we can't put up big charts about this, but that's a critical function. Yeah. So I think, at least my hope is that we find some, you know, some funding support for the great statements made by political leaders. I think all around, hopefully they'll put some money behind that and continue to help with their services. Jean, I'm just aware of the time, and my deepest apologies to everyone, Abir, Steve, you know, Marvo. Hi, Marvo. You know, just a whole host of folks who had asked questions, and we couldn't get to it. Jean, I just want to thank you again for taking the time to do this webinar. I think this is a great conversation. Hopefully, at some point, we'll talk more specifically about some policies. But I just want to thank everyone in the audience. Thank you for being here. Thanks for all the questions and staying with us on this issue. I just want to quickly sort of give you guys our contact. If you do want to contact us, there's Jean's email address and my email address. We're happy to listen to you and provide any additional information if we can. Please go look at what ICA does they've got some amazing stuff. And if you have the opportunity, please do contribute to their private sponsorship, because I think it may be opening up soon. I have done it, and some of my colleagues here at Gustavson School of Business have done it. So thank you all, and we hope to see you somewhere soon. Bye.